I mean, the background is the Great Recession, so the worldwide recession, which affected Ireland particularly badly. Our economy was pretty much destroyed as a result of it. We're only now coming out of that. And there was a huge amount of anger with the politicians and the political process about it. So the government that was elected in 2011 made a manifesto promise that if they were elected, they would establish a constitutional convention to review our constitution. The argument being that we needed to review where we were as a society, as a country. That was the sort of motivation. So it was in the midst of a crisis. And the government that was formed in 2011 was a coalition of two parties. One party had promised a constitutional convention, which would be a mix of politicians and citizens and experts. And the other party was promising something like the British Columbia Citizens' Assembly, so an entity that would only have citizens. And so when they formed the coalition, they had to compromise. And the compromise was to set up a constitutional convention that would be 2/3 citizens and 1/3 politicians. So it was nothing more than a compromise. It was more accident than design that they created this unusual thing. It was as inclusive as they could make it. I mean, of course, we're dealing with 66 places. So realistically, you're never going to make it completely inclusive. But the objective was that the citizens that would be selected were as much as possible a random selection of ordinary citizens from all across the country. Now, it was not a perfectly random process of selecting. It was quota based. So the objective was that 50% of the members would be women, 50% men. It was also quotas based on age, on region, and on socioeconomic background. So when you put all that together, you get 66 people who literally were selected by an opinion poll company knocking on their door. You know, somebody knocked on a person's door and said, "You're it, you've been selected, would you like to come?" And I think in, 40 out of 1 cases, they said, "Bugger off, we're not interested in this." So eventually they managed to find 66 citizens who were prepared to give up that time to be the members. And then the other third were members of the National Parliament who self-selected. So it was MPs who basically said, I want to be involved. So it was a very unusual bolting together, coupling of these two different kinds of members. As it happens, it is happening again, a version of it. So, I mean, I wouldn't want to suggest it was a Eureka moment and everyone said, "This is brilliant, we've got to do this again." There was a lot of criticism of it from the beginning, and there still is criticism of it to this very day. So there are a lot of people who were never converted to the idea. But as I'll be saying in my talk later on, I think there's enough evidence to suggest that it was successful on the whole. And one of the pieces of evidence for me to say that is that a few months ago, a new government created another citizens' assembly. This time it's 100 members who are all citizens, but the same method, random selection, opinion poll company, following the same method. And right now, only last weekend, they were having another meeting. They're discussing a very hot topic in Ireland, which is our constitutional ban on abortion. I wouldn't say they have as much say as the MP. As the MPs who are members, they have as much say, absolutely. But as MPs in the Parliament, no. I mean, the outcome of the Constitutional Convention that we had before and the new Citizens' Assembly that we're having now is a set of recommendations that go to the Parliament, and the Parliament can choose to accept or disagree with those recommendations. So the process has a voice, but I wouldn't put it much more strongly than that. It helps. It's a useful process for helping to frame a debate, sometimes a very difficult debate, and perhaps add a new perspective as to how you have that debate. But they have no right of firm recommendation.
Would you define this as sort of a populist movement? And in your general opinion, how inclusive are populist movements ever?
I mean, I'm not a big fan of populist movements. I think they're quite a dangerous development. That's not something that I would have much support for. So I don't like the phenomenon that we're seeing across the world right now of growing populism. But I don't see this as an example of anything remotely to do with that. Because in this instance, in these Irish cases, these are entities that were established by the government. So what I read into that as a political scientist is that this is an effort, an imperfect effort, but it's an effort by our political establishment to adapt, to try and renew how democracy operates, to use the language of deliberative theorists. It's bolting onto the ecology of our representative institutions a new body that has a voice, that gives a voice to ordinary citizens in debates about how we run our political system. So I think it's an interesting experiment, because it, after all, is still at an experimental stage. But I think it bodes well for the future, that we could see things like this being used elsewhere.
So there definitely is then a distinction between sort of the raw populism and the actual participatory democracy mechanisms that are being used in this example.
Definitely, because in this instance, what you're getting is that those citizens who are so fortunate to be selected are becoming educated on the topics. I mean, the whole idea behind the deliberation is that you should go in with an open mind. You should become informed on the issues and be open to the idea that your mind might change. It may not. You just might reinforce your existing position.
Right.
But you should be open to the possibility of changing your views on things. So those citizens, by the end, I mean, I'd witnessed some of the work of the British Columbia Citizens Assembly in 2003, 2004. And by the end of that process, those citizens were world experts on electoral systems. They knew more than many professors of political science about electoral systems, because they become so informed on the topic. And it's not just that they become, the members become informed on the issues that they're discussing. They also become more satisfied with their role as citizens. So in measures of efficacy and measures of how positive you feel about your democracy, there's plenty of indicators to show that participants in processes like this are becoming much more positive as citizens. I think it's very generalizable. I mean, we borrowed from the Canadians. It was British Columbia and Ontario that were the first to try this. Mm-hmm. So in Ireland, there was a lot of discussion around the setting up of the Irish Constitutional Convention about the BC model. So we copied you guys. We've seen it. We're seeing it in other countries. So only last weekend in Lisbon in Portugal, there was a citizens' assembly organised by a bunch of individuals who decided that they wanted to promote that agenda in the Portuguese system. The British, we've seen something similar about a year or two ago in Britain. We've seen it in Belgium, we've seen it in Iceland, in Estonia. So there's a growing number of countries where, quite independently of each other, groups of individuals are coming up with this idea of an approach like this. And it's only a matter of time before something like this could snowball. Yeah, I suppose the only thing that's really interesting for me is, as I arrive in Montreal last night, and I'm talking with colleagues over lunch today, how much interest there is in the debate about electoral reform here in Canada. And
it's a really hot topic.
It's a very hot topic here, and not for the first time. I mean, at different stages, I know in recent history, it's bubbled up. Electoral reform has bubbled up as a topic at federal level. Mm-hmm. And it just seems quite unusual that, given the world's first examples provided by British Columbia and Ontario at provincial level of engaging citizens in citizens' assemblies about electoral reform for those provinces, it just seems strange that that isn't on the agenda here, that if you have a truly reforming government, as those of us from outside seem to think you do have, why that topic of a citizens' assembly isn't being discussed here.
Yeah, I'm always struck too by the sort of the contrast between this sort of process that's going in Ireland and in Canada, to sort of see how we can make the democracy more representative and more efficient, whereas in the US, the sort of anti-establishment and anti-elitist rhetoric has not taken the form of a more inclusive democracy. It's actually taken the form of, in a lot of ways, more insulated
That's right.
Elites, and unfortunately a large cross-section of American society bought into it. And
yeah, it's rather unfortunate to see what's going on south of here, but those of us from outside looking in on Canada right now are looking at what seems to us at least to be a very positive vista. I mean, we're quite jealous of you guys. But there seems to be a government, I'm sure it's not perfect,
right.
I'm sure it's not, but that it does seem to be trying to make changes in how Canadian politics operates. And as I said, the bit that's missing, for me at least, is why not engage with the citizens in a process that we know can work? It would work so beautifully here if they could try it. Yeah, I mean, the United States is going through a very sad period in its history, and I don't follow it closely enough other than as an observer like yourself. It seems to be in a very sad place, and it's got a lot of mending to be done. I don't see any sort of process like I've been discussing with you, such as a citizens' assembly, happening overnight in a country like that.
It's also not a parliamentary system either.
Yes, that's right, and it's such a huge system. There's an issue about the politics of scale here, but I certainly think it lends itself to what is, at least on the scale of things, an inclusive society that you have here in Canada.
Yeah.
I think something like that could work very well here.
Well, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.